My name is Judy Wu. I'm a professor of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Irvine. And I'm really proud to be part of this editorial team and this really wonderful series, US and the World. I'm delighted to be moderating the conversation today with Nancy Shoemaker and Maureen Santelli to celebrate their new books. But before we return to them, I'd like to ask my co-editors to introduce themselves. Ben, would you like to go first?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Coates. I teach the history of the US and the world at Wake Forest University, and I work on issues at the intersection of empire, law, and internationalism. And just want to thank everyone for being here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Emily, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Conroy-Krutz. I teach at Michigan State University, and my research is in 19th century religion and foreign relations. I'm thrilled to have two other 19th centuryists presenting their new work here today. And welcome, everyone.
And Paul Kramer.
Hi, I'm Paul Kramer. I specialize in the history of the modern US and the world with an emphasis on race, migration, and empire at Vanderbilt University. Yeah, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much. And if you could just go ahead and mute yourselves. So we'll get the stage over to Nancy and Maureen. Maureen, maybe I'll have you speak first. And if you can spend a few minutes telling us about your book, which is wonderful. The title is The Greek Fire, American-Ottoman Relations and Democratic Fervor in the Age of Revolutions. And after that, Nancy will offer some comments. Then I would like to engage with you in some Q&A. And I encourage the audience to also post questions in Q&A, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. So I'm going to turn this over to Maureen.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited about our conversation. I thought what I would do is just very briefly walk through just the evolution of the book, how the topic kind of came about, and then just sort of how I tackled it. Initially, the book was going to be a very focused topic. It stemmed from my dissertation. Initially, I really was interested in the classical influence on early America. I had done some previous research on the influence of the classics on the First Federal Congress in the 1790s. And through that, I became interested in just, what direction did that influence go? Did it continue to resonate within the public consciousness? And that eventually brought me to the evolution of a more Roman influence to a Greek one coming into the 1820s. And so then that sort of stimulated my interest in why the transition, what's going on. And that brought me ultimately to the overwhelming enthusiasm that existed within the public consciousness for the Greek War for Independence. And so that brought me to looking at the American Philhellenic movement, their initial just sort of romantic lip service to the revolution, which then drew them into a more tangible effort to put together military supplies and humanitarian aid. And then I thought that would be sort of the extent of the topic, but that, of course, then naturally brought me to looking at what kind of impact did the American public imagine that they would have in Greece, and to what end? So that ultimately then brought me to discovering these different groups that were operating within the Eastern Mediterranean, within the Ottoman Empire in particular. So merchants, for example, entered into my story where I wasn't initially looking to have them enter into the story. Missionaries also factor in heavily in the story. And then even just enthusiasts in ancient Greece. And so, of course, the Philhellenes. And that really complicates the story beyond just this interest in ancient Greece, because if they want to operate within the Ottoman Empire, and I mean all of these groups, they have to kind of play by the Ottoman Empire's rules, namely not supporting rebellions, right? So that then brought me to looking at how just the support for Greek independence was so complicated, that it wasn't just about, yay, another republic in the world, that there were other factors in play. In particular, the United States' interest in gaining a navigational treaty with the Ottomans. That then brought the story into looking at the very complicated international relations scene with not just the United States and the Ottoman Empire, but Europe and what was going on there. So different groups that I looked at here, and I thought of my story as being driven by people's stories, or at least I tried to make it that kind of story. So merchants, in particular, the American merchant David Offley, but then also supported by really interesting characters such as George Bethune-English, who I hopefully will get a chance to talk more about later. He supposedly converted to Islam and becomes a secret agent under the Monroe administration and then the John Quincy Adams administration. The US presence in the Ottoman Empire, especially the Mediterranean Squadron, their efforts to protect merchants, but then they're also supposed to be protecting Philhellenes. Stanley Gridley Howe, for example, is one of the more famous Philhellenes who goes to Greece, and just the conflict of interest there. Missionaries, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, with the Palestine mission in particular. So Pliny Fisk, for example, Levi Parsons, and just their interests in Greece and operating in the midst of revolution in the Eastern Mediterranean. And then, of course, I mentioned already the Philhellenes who are entering into Greece. There were Americans who fought in the Greek army. There were agents who arrived in Greece that were supported financially by Philhellenic groups, especially out of New York and Boston. And then after looking at all of this, that made me start to wonder, what kind of impact is all of this having on the United States itself? And really, it was the sources talking about sort of these conflicts of interest. In particular, the Philhellenic movement is calling for Greek independence because allegedly the Ottomans are enslaving the Greeks, and how horrific this is. This shouldn't be taking place. I also look into how this was universally supported both in the North and the South. Peoples of the American South didn't seem to be terribly worried that they were condemning slavery abroad, and yet slavery existed within their own borders. And it was through doing research at the Library Company of Philadelphia where one of the librarians pointed me in the direction of the influence that the Philhellenic movement had on reform, in particular at first the abolitionist movement. David Walker's pamphlet about slavery and how he's reading this newspaper talking about the condemnation of slavery in the Ottoman Empire, and right next to that same article is a advertisement looking to discover runaway slaves. And so what that made me realize is that more than just this sort of external interest in Greece, this imagined identity that Americans supposedly shared with the ancient Greeks, that Americans not only are coming out of the United States and having an impact on international affairs, but those affairs were also influencing domestic issues. So the Philhellenic movement becomes infused with the abolitionist movement that is really gaining momentum by beginning at the end of the 1820s, excuse me. William Lloyd Garrison, for example, allegedly wanted to go to Greece. Doesn't, of course, but the rhetoric of the Philhellenic movement becomes infused in his initial speeches in the late 1820s. And then from there, the Philhellenic movement, or at least the rhetoric of it, remains very much intact for the coming decades leading up to the American Civil War and arguably even beyond. So the role of women in Greece, in a hopefully newly independent Greece. So education reform, led primarily by Emma Willard. So we have women coming out of the domestic sphere, coming onto an international stage, but it also is influencing reform within our own borders. And then also there is some indication of the influence of Philhellenism within the women's suffrage movement. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in their biography on the suffrage movement in the 1880s, specifically referenced Philhellenic rhetoric, condemning the treatment of women in the US on the level of, well, if the Turks are the antithesis of what it is to be American, how can Americans continue to treat women in similar ways that, at least in their minds, women were treated within the Ottoman Empire? So that's sort of the evolution of my book. It takes on a number of different themes. And again, I'm looking forward to the conversation that we'll have with Nancy's book.
Yes, hi. So my book, Pursuing Respect in the Cannibal Isles, came out of my research on American Indian, New England Indian whalemen in the 19th century. And as I was doing research for that book, I read a lot of memoirs, travel accounts by whalemen, by sailors, by other people, where I was looking for whalemen in foreign places. And it was just an amazing window into how, in this time period, the first half of the 19th century, there were just thousands of Americans everywhere. You know, some memoirist would be wandering around some rainforest jungle somewhere and come across an American planter, or you know, on a Pacific island, there were always a few American beachcombers. So I became interested in that, just the extent of American involvement abroad in the form of these sort of ordinary people seeking something. And I was particularly struck by Fiji, kind of for two reasons. One is that it turned, I was looking for American Indians who had settled somewhere else, relocated, and I discovered one in Fiji, a Seminole Indian, John Spar. And so I ended up focusing a bit on him in the whaling book. But the other thing about why I got so interested in Fiji was that it was just bizarre that the Americans who were there said such horrible things about it. And so you wonder, why would they go there? And so my book tries to answer that question. Why were Americans in Fiji? And I focus on three individuals. If you go to Fiji today, these are the three Americans who you would hear about in the country's history. And I have two chapters on each. They're sort of mini biographies. But they focus, the point is to show the variety of motivations that Americans had in looking for opportunity, looking for something. I say respect is what they were looking for, but in respect in different forms. And I have to say, it was interesting. I've heard people, biographers, talk about their experience and this problem of becoming too attached to their people. And I have to say, my three people, I don't know if it was me or if it was them, but they end up not being very admirable people, I think. So, and that might be me. They all, of course, pretty much thought they were admirable. That's the point of the book, and exploring their lives. But I call them foot soldiers for US expansion. And that it's really these people with their assorted motivations who were sort of going overseas and pursuing their own interests, but at the same time, sort of strongly identifying with a sort of vague American interest. And yet they were also doing this in very different ways. And also often at odds with each other, which is one of the points of Maureen's book as well, which is interesting that this ends up being one of our common themes. So I wrote down, in fact, that I won't go through them because I think they'll come out in the Q&A, but I wrote down what I noticed as similarities between our two books and the differences. And I just thought it was very interesting to read the two books together, or well, obviously I wrote one, and didn't reread it for this event. But just to think about the two books together and the ways in which you get, I think, such a richer picture of the US and the world in this early American time period, because in some ways the stories are so very different, because Fiji and the Ottoman Empire and Greece, these are very different places in the American imagination. But also there are some really strong similarities, I think, in the books, in our process, probably. So I look forward to talking more about it with Maureen and with the rest of you.
Thank you so much to both of you. And I just want to make sure I announce Nancy's book's name as well. It's Pursuing Respect in the Cannibal Isles, Cannibal Isles, Americans in 19th Century Fiji. Fiji. I became a camera enthusiast, so I have Fuji on my mind. One of the questions I wanted to ask you is how to conceptualize Americans abroad in both of your books. And Nancy, I thought you had this wonderful introduction, and you've elaborated on some of these ideas in an essay as well, to conceptualize what constitutes this American presence abroad. And you talk about how it's not an empire, it's not a borderland situation, it's not settler colonialism. And you decide to use the phrase extraterritorial Americans. So non-territorial, yet still national space constituted by mobile Americans. And I want to compare that to the way Maureen conceptualizes sort of the American presence in the Greek Ottoman region, right? You use the idea of empire of ideas. So this is a quote from your book. It cannot be said that these early Americans were imperialists in the traditional sense. They were nevertheless attempted to build an empire of American ideas, where free trade, republicanism, and Protestant reform would have the transformative influence over foreign people. So I was wondering if you could both talk a little bit about how you came to these conceptions and understandings, and why other rubrics were inadequate for what you were trying to capture in your historical research.
So I'll go first then. Yeah, so there are a lot of things I didn't like that I talk about in the introduction. But one would be Americans abroad, insipid. It sounds like tourists in Paris. And empire, I guess, we all have different views on that. I could have done the formal versus informal empire, it certainly fit how scholars use informal empire. But I rejected empire because Americans, I never wanted to convey the impression that in this time period, up to 1860s, that Americans were somehow the dominant power. In Fiji, they were not. They were very demanding and noisy and involved, but they were never dominant. Fijians were always dominant. And then also, yes, settler colonialism is now one of these terms that's sort of proliferating, so people are finding it everywhere. And I just wanted to make it clear that no one would sort of apply that term here, because Fijians remain the dominant. They are the indigenous people of Fiji, and they are also in control of the government in Fiji today. So, yeah, I was just really looking for, I don't think we have a good term for this, and I was kind of hoping extraterritorial Americans would take off, but of course it has this real problem, which is people can't pronounce it, including me. And also people seem to confuse it with extraterrestrial Americans. And so that's also, that's another problem. Yeah, if someone has a better term out there, I think you should make a stab at making that take over from Americans abroad, which is, our fallback term. Muted.
Sorry about that. I was just so engaged in listening. So I really struggled with this issue, and I'm glad that we're starting off with this. I struggled to find a term that I liked, that I thought fit. You can't say that Americans are being completely imperialist or even colonialist, because of course, at least in my book, their goal isn't to adopt Greece as part of the US borders. So in a traditional sense, of course, it's not colonialism, it's not imperialism. However, at least with the groups that I focused on, so especially the missionaries and the Philhellenes, if we're speaking about Greece in particular, they want Greece to be independent. They want Greece to have a republic. But they want Greece to have a republic in the similar grain that the United States has a republic. And in fact, and I think I tended to use non-state actors when I was discussing this. And I know, Nancy, you talk a little bit about that term also in your intro. So, for example, there is one instance where one of the American Philhellenes, who is fighting in the Greek army, had a number of audiences with officials for the provisional Greek government. And there's one conversation in particular where, and this is with the Greek official Mavrokordatos. And this Philhellene basically says, the American Philhellenic movement is not going to support Greek independence anymore, and we're not going to send any more aid if you guys even think about embracing monarchy. That's not what we're interested in. You are going to adopt a republic, right? And and he doesn't have permission to be talking about this or negotiating terms in an official way. And yet here he is trying to put some pressure on what kind of government the Greeks will embrace after independence. And of course, and again, my book talks about just how complicated all of this is. Mavrokordatos, of course, assures him, oh, yes, we want a republic. And yet I found that there was already conversations being had about the British assisting some kind of conclusion for the revolution, even at that time. So, yeah, I tended to use non-state actors. I wasn't satisfied with that term. I agree. I think it would be great if we could come to a term that just would really take off and work. But it's complicated, right? Because again, they're not adopting these areas as US territories or anything like that. And yet, at least in my research, they wanted them to be US territories in the sense that these ideas are going to be adopted. So ideas regarding republicanism, even American strains of Protestantism. So the Greeks are Christian, but not the right kind of Christian, right? So we need to send missionaries off and introduce them to Calvinism and whatnot. So yeah, this is a fascinating strain, I think, that we both kind of, we address, at least in our own different ways.
Yeah, I'll just elaborate on the non-state actors, if that's okay, Judy.
Actually,
yes,
that was my next question.
Because anyone who works on US consuls, I think you realize right away that it becomes a very ambiguous term, figuring out what might be non-state or state, because there's no line, really, there's no clear line. Because they're kind of private people acting as representatives of the state. And so that's why it was an unsatisfactory term for me. And even ordinary Americans seem to think they had some pull with the state, some right to protection. And so I'm not sure that they are non-state actors if they saw that the state was helping them in what they wanted to do.
Yeah, if I can just tack onto that. So the American Philhellenes absolutely did not have permission from the US government to be influencing anything in regards to a Greek government or a free Greek government. But there also were agents, secret agents being sent by the US government. Again, my guy that I talk a lot about is George Bethune-English. So he does have permission through the state to be operating to try and negotiate a navigational treaty, but it's not official, it's under the table. And that's largely because there isn't an agreement yet. And the United States is also very much aware that if they publicly announce, we want a navigational treaty and this is our guy that's being sent off to do this, that's going to cause major political issues on the European stage. And in fact, the British ambassador to the Sublime Porte, the Turkish, Constantinople, there we go, we'll go with that, they had made multiple efforts to block the United States from having any kind of navigational rights in the Eastern Mediterranean, let alone to Constantinople. So even like non-state actor, it's too broad.
I'm so glad that you pursued this question, because this really was my question to both of you. And I liked what Nancy, I think, used as like not quite state actors, and the ways in which these supposedly non-state actors actually evoke the state in various ways. And Maureen, I think for your book as well, thinking about some of these merchants and how they served as informal diplomats when the US did not have formal roles in those regions. Since you already talked about that, I wanted to ask you about the ways in which Greece and Fiji are diametrically opposed in many ways in the American imagination, that Greece is the origin of Western civilization, especially white Western civilization, and Fiji is a place which practices cannibalism. It's the antithesis of civilization. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the ways in which Americans imagine these locations.
Okay, I'll start again. Yes, that is one of the main differences I noticed when I read Maureen's book. So, and you said it very well, Judy, so I'm not sure I can say more because you just said it, but that really was a pronounced difference. They both seem to be evil and other, and race is somehow murkily part of the picture, but it really seems to be a sort of cultural antithesis. But in the case of the Ottoman Empire, they're like an evil empire and a racial other in that sense. And Fijians are regarded by Americans as people who are uncivil. And I think the Ottoman Empire is regarded as civil, it's just wrong-headed, but yeah, an ancient society yeah.
Nancy, maybe you can say a little bit about the ways in which race might play a role in the ways in which Americans imagine Fijians, but then also you mentioned that the presence of diverse Americans in Fiji also complicated the understandings of race.
Yes. So so what really, this is also actually sort of the point of my book, Native American Whalemen and the World as well, is that when these Americans of color go abroad, that being American counts more than as part of their identity in terms of, they're protected like other Americans somewhat by the US government. They are treated by white Americans as fellow Americans, even though there might also be racial slurs and racial comments about them. Yes, so yes, I do have one issue. I guess it would fit here, but it might be off topic. But the other thing I thought about that was interesting about Maureen's, the context of Maureen's history and the history I was telling, is that Maureen seemed to me to resonate more with modern day issues in US foreign relations history, because even though I don't think you really addressed this explicitly, it seemed to be a story of the sort of idealism versus realism sort of paradigm, that there were some people who had this sort of idea that American democracy should spread around the world, that they were kind of humanitarian in their orientation to the rest of the world. And then you had these other people who were just, making money and trading. And to me, that seemed just a really major difference. Certainly I guess you could say there were some of those same attitudes expressed by Americans in Fiji. But I think Fiji, to me, the Americans in Fiji, that story seems to me like a place apart somehow from US foreign relations. Like, I could see that the story you were telling, Maureen, could kind of be traced up to this continues to happen in US foreign relations, but I don't think there's a parallel in like 1950 to the story I was telling about Americans in Fiji. I can't really think of one. But, again, I think that attaches to the issue of the evil, seeing one place as sort of an ancient civilization, but foreign and other, and the other place as being sort of a place of savagery. I'm not sure how much that's, I guess the issue would be, I'm not sure how much that savagery motif, how much that might have endured into the 20th century. I think that would be an interesting question, or the 21st century.
Yeah, so just in listening what you were just saying, so American perceptions of Greece, there's kind of a dichotomy in the sense that Americans, when they first think of Greece, think of the ancient Greeks, and they think of great figures like Pericles, for example, or Homer. And so in tracing back to the early years of the United States, where they're trying to adopt a new identity, where they initially sort of take hold to the idea of Roman republicanism and then eventually Greek democracy, those ideas on sort of an imagined ancestral connection resonated with Americans. But there also was this interesting contrast where Phil Helens, especially, and then and they write about it when they're in Greece, and but it seems to resonate with the general public, that they had this universal understanding that the Greeks had become degraded, I guess, for lack of a better word, because of their subjugation under Ottoman rule, and that Phil Helens somehow would help them rejuvenate their so-called lost culture and restore them to the purity of their ancient roots. So, for example, and the missionaries talk about this too. They'll be visiting the ruins of ancient sites, and they'll write about how basically condemning the modern Greeks for not taking better care of their ruins. How dare you guys let these go? It's a good thing that we're coming into Greece to help you all realize what you have here and to help you restore the greatness of ancient Greece. Even the modern Greek language, Thomas Jefferson speaks about this way back in the 1780s, that in hoping for Greek independence, it won't take much to help the Greeks realize that their modern Greek language is just not pure enough, and we can purify it back to the ancient Greek language. So it's not wholly that the Greeks are perfect or put on a pedestal. They need work, but they need work in the American imagination of what kind of help they need. So again, what kind of government is going to be put into place? Religion also. Obviously the ancient Greeks weren't Christian, so that's another interesting element that comes in. So restore them to their ancient perfectness, but of course Christian, but of course the Protestant influence that's predominant in especially in New England, in the United States. So I guess. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. But yeah, so even though there is a huge difference between how Americans view Greece versus Fiji, there is still this sense of superiority.
Thanks to both of you for the response. I have some follow-up questions, but there's a great one from our audience. Ben Wright, thank you for these outstanding books. I'd like to hear a bit more about how your stories show the importance of understanding American racial formation through the history of US and the world. What do you see your stories telling us about the history of American racial formation, and how does shifting understandings of race influence the way Americans acted abroad?
So yes, I didn't really answer it very thoroughly when Judy raised the topic, except to say that sort of race didn't matter as much as nationality when Americans were overseas in terms of their experiences. In Fiji, this is sort of a controversial topic in terms of the language and issue of race. So I hope no one misunderstands me when I just briefly try to summarize it. But since the early 19th century, the Pacific, Oceania, has been sort of divided into two categories in this sort of study of the races of mankind. One being Polynesian, sort of light-skinned, beautiful, lots of sex, these sorts of stereotypes of what Polynesian people are like, hula dances. So there's that sort of group. But then in the Western, particularly Southwestern Pacific, based on this sort of ancient term by a French thinker on race, they're known as Melanesian versus Polynesian, and they tend to be darker. And so often you would see Americans in Fiji referring to Fijians as using the N-word or as Black, whereas you wouldn't see that so much in Polynesian places where Americans were. So clearly there was this sort of racial element in American perceptions that somehow the darker people were, the lower they were on the scale of humanity. So I don't know if that really answers the question. In the time period I studied, there didn't really seem to be a change when, in terms of how Fijians enter into the American imagination through the sort of popular culture, where people start throwing around the word, an insult, that you're acting like a Fijian or whatever. It was sort of synonymous with cannibalism. And so it isn't so much, it's obviously connected to race, but it's really more connected to this, this sort of cultural dehumanization of Fijians as cannibals, and that's the origins of their, why Americans sort of despise them.
So how I tackle the influence of race, not so much in like a formation or racial formation in the US, but more in the sense of how did Americans perceive the modern Greeks racially, and why that would influence them to support Greek independence. I look at the initial emergence of the Greek Revolution is in 1821. So this is in the immediate outset of the Missouri Compromise. We see rising sectionalism, and the Philhellenic movement in the United States, as far as I could glean from all of the research I did, there was a universal support for Greek independence, both in the North and the South. And this was in part anyway, based upon the understanding that the Greeks were white. And this is partly, as Nancy was just talking about, this compartmentalization of how the races were categorized. There were several studies in the 19th century regarding that whiteness, like at its purest state, is equated to the Apollo Belvedere statue. So again, going back to antiquity and this understanding that the Greeks are these perfect human beings, and they've sort of fallen down on hard times because they are under the subjugation of the Ottomans. But if we can just help to support independence, they're going to regain that status. So this resonates within the American South. In fact, I received a lot of feedback on this. Like, surely there's some pushback in the South regarding supporting Greece, and as far as I could find, there really wasn't. There was no divergence in support for the Greeks between the North and South. Sure, there was maybe more mobilization in the more urban areas in the North, but it was just as much supported in the South. Where I start to see race and different perceptions on race coming in is really how the Philhellenic movement influences the domestic perception of abolitionism, moving from the late 1820s up to the Civil War, where, and actually where I specifically talk about this is the grand tour of Hiram Power's Greek Slave. And this is the first nude statue that toured the United States. It first arrived in New York and made its way into the southern states. And it's through the influence of the Philhellenic movement, where they have condemned Ottoman slavery, and the abolitionists basically say, how can we possibly say that Ottoman slavery is bad, but slavery in the United States is okay? And you guys are totally basing this on race. So race enters into this existing conversation regarding Philhellenism. Now, how did Southerners respond to this new or monkey wrench into the conversation? From what I could see, they didn't really respond to it. There didn't seem to be, it didn't really enter into their minds. To them, the Greeks are white, so that was okay. But slavery as it exists in the American South is a completely different institution and isn't something that can exist in the same conversation. So I guess that's where I tackle understanding of race. And then I actually, in talking with Greek scholars more recently, they have sort of commented on that, because of course, when Greek Americans really first to immigrate into the United States by the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, I've had several scholars say, well, that's really interesting because the Greeks arguably were not considered to be white when they actually arrive in the United States. So again, different perceptions historically regarding the Greeks.
Thanks to both of you. I was just going to refer folks to a book by Maylee Irvine called Possessing Polynesia, and refers to some of the discussions about racial formation that Nancy was speaking of. This kind of segues well to my next set of questions. One detail I thought was very interesting, Maureen, in your book, is that there was a group of African-American women who were supporting the Greek Revolution. And so I'm curious about how they navigate these politics of freedom, and with the racialization of the Greeks. But my transition is to think about how gender plays a significant role in both of your works. I'm thinking about, Maureen, your discussion about women's benevolent political activism and how there's a connection to women's suffrage movements, I think, later on. And then Nancy, one of your main characters is a woman, and I think you go through a very interesting discussion about how she navigates her identity and her social status in her writing, but also in the male protagonists or antagonists in your stories. They're also trying to think about how do they navigate their social roles in Fiji in terms of gender. So I was hoping that both of you could speak a little bit more about how gender plays a role in your studies.
Okay, I always seem to be starting, but I hope you don't mind, Maureen.
Fine, please.
I noticed that too. That was one of the things I thought was interesting, that both our books actually talk about gender and slavery in ways where it's somehow as though Americans are thinking through these things through their international experiences. But in very different ways, since Maureen has this sort of issue of white slavery, this sort of history of that in the Mediterranean that Americans are remembering or evoking. And in my book, the slavery comes up because the sea captain's wife, who is one of my main characters, essentially enslaves a young Fijian girl, and yet would consider herself anti-slavery in her views. And so, and then, yeah, the gender issue is a bit different. I think the women in Maureen's book, correct me if I'm wrong, but they do seem to be kind of mobilizing in a classic women's political activism kind of way that we associate with the 19th century, creating organizations that come together and are providing mutual aid, and also lobbying for political rights for women. And whereas I have this sort of one individual who I argue is more about sort of self-empowerment for herself, and that she doesn't actually seem to like other women much or associate with them. She certainly doesn't talk about them very much. And so I see her sort of scrambling for a respect as a woman in a male world. And so what's really fascinating about her is how fascinated she was with the most powerful men in Fiji. And so she just seems, and with trying to pull them down, to pull them down. And so you get this sort of interesting intersectionality between sort of race and gender, where as a white woman, she can kind of claim superiority over or try to claim superiority over these very powerful men who she deems savage. And so I hope that's enough. But
can I just ask you to say a little bit more? I think also in the discussion with the Beachcomber, David Whitby, the ways in which he's trying to navigate his status within Fijian society and what he will say no to and what he will say yes to. But part of that has to do with his gendered identity of being a husband and forming marital and sexual relationships.
Yes, he's kind of more than a husband in a way, because he becomes a kind of patriarch for the people of mixed descent in Fiji, the descendants of other beachcombers. And he acts, I think, always in a very patriarchal way, trying to defend his community, being there as the sort of ultimate decision maker, helping people get what they want. And he has this large, family of several wives and children from the different wives. So yes, you're making me feel bad, Judy, because I don't make the gender explicit when I talk about the men in the same way that I do with the sea captain's wife. But certainly, I have lots of instances of sexual exploitation of Fijian women by the American men in Fiji. And so I guess that comes up in the chapters, involving him. But yes, in terms of where they will draw the line, they certainly, most of them seem like they, most of the American men in Fiji are quite willing to sort of adopt that aspect of Fijian life, polygamy, but not other aspects. So it is interesting where they draw the line. I'm still not satisfying you, I'm sure, but
I'm not at all disappointed. I think your book is really fascinating.
Well, and actually, if I could just, I'll answer the question, but I just wanted to interject. I think it was at that part in Nancy's book where talking about what, engaging in Fijian culture, but like certain limits of where they're willing to go with the polygamy thing. I think there's a quote, it says that they refuse to engage in polygamy. They refuse to live a la Turk. And when I read that, I wondered, is that like referencing like the harem?
Yeah.
I was just like, I saw the connection there. I was like, yeah, that's kind of cool. So in responding to the question, so women, of course, factor pretty heavily into the Philhellenic movement, especially when it takes a turn for the more humanitarian focus. In the book, I talk a little bit about why that shift takes place, and the sources didn't completely indicate why that shift took place. So in 1821, when independence, the war for independence first begins, there's this interest in sending military aid, and it's a few years later where all of a sudden there's this shift. More towards sending not supplies to the army, but instead aiding civilians, especially women and children. I had seen some indications that was driven in part by the Philhellenic movement itself, because women, their domain, of course, is the domestic. They can engage in local public affairs if it has to do with the home. So helping destitute women, children, orphans, that sort of thing, that would be within their purview. So men like Edward Everett, Matthew Carey, they actively wrote to female circles in Philadelphia, Boston, asking them to mobilize to support civilian aid. There's also some indication that the shift might have been at least certainly supported by the US government under the table, because again, they're trying to negotiate a navigational treaty with the Ottomans. They don't want to look like they're supporting Greek independence. So if we can just have, this just be something that's in the public purview, you guys support, humanitarian efforts, that's going to be an easier thing to swallow for the Sultan than are coming back and saying, yeah, we have civilians sending aid to help the Greeks in their rebellion. So women really engaged in a grassroots effort to raise funds. They went so far as going into the communities, asking for donations. I, in several archival repositories, found hundreds upon hundreds of receipts from Philhellenes throughout the country, many of which were like female-led groups. Oftentimes, the monies would be sent by a male representative rather than the women themselves. But they were an important part in the United States' sending of aid. The book also then looks at how emerging onto a more international stage, where they have this interest in Greece, that then fed interest in taking like education reform, which had really gotten off the ground in the United States, to an international stage. And I, in particular, talk about Emma Willard and her efforts with the Troy Society to send teachers, to send aid, to open schools for Greek girls, but also Greek boys. They are co-ed, or some of these institutions were co-ed. But women found an avenue, if you will, to emerge onto the international stage in this relief effort. And then from that, I argue that their knowledge of the Philhellenic movement, the rhetoric of it all, helping to aid women abroad, children abroad, that this influences interest in women's reform in the United States. I fully acknowledge that a lot of these women who are, respectable women, more elite women, they aren't necessarily becoming suffragettes, but the rhetoric of the Philhellenic movement is infused within reformist circles in the antebellum period. And you initially asked about the African-American women. that was one thing I was really disappointed that I couldn't find more on. I do have a reference to that, where there's at least one group that put together a ball to raise aid for the Greeks. I think that would be an awesome thing to find more on if the source material is available. I do know that Haiti was one of the first nation states to recognize Greek independence. I don't know if there would be a connection with this, but it would be fascinating to know more.
Thanks to both of you. I have one more question, but I wanted to make sure, Nancy, you had developed a list of kind of similarities and differences. I just want to make space in case you wanted to raise issues that we haven't had a chance to talk about.
Yes, thanks. Actually, I did think there were two other interesting things, so I'll just mention them briefly, but maybe Maureen would want to respond as well to them. The other two similarities I noticed was that in both our studies, I think the British have this are really present, and it's interesting to think about how, you can't really tell this story of Americans overseas in this time period without accounting for the British being there. Usually they're first, they're more active, they have more warships, that sort of thing. So I thought that was interesting. In your case, it's Lord Byron, who kind of becomes this role model for, and in my case, it's just, the British are there all the time. And of course, eventually Fiji falls to the British as a colony. The other thing I thought was interesting, this you might want to say something about, Maureen. I sense this, but I don't know if it's the case, that you and I may have faced the same challenge, which we are American historians, but have to, writing mainly to an American history audience, or readership, that's the audience. And yet we are talking about other places too. And this challenge of how much of that other place do you go into detail about, because you don't want to lose the American history audience. And I sense this particularly because Fiji history would be so foreign. I imagined my audience, the vast majority of my readership would be people who would have to look up where Fiji was on a map, because that was certainly my situation until about 8 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, not knowing where it was or really anything about it, except maybe now Fiji water, which we all know about. So I just thought how you dealt with that. I mean, I really kind of had to make the choice. I have to keep it short. I just can't go into too much Fiji history. On the other hand, it was a real challenge because I didn't want to kind of assault that history or, and it was also new to me. I had to come to learn about it in a way that was, as an outsider to that field. It was really, I think, the most challenging thing in writing the book for me.
Yeah, so I'll respond to that. And then I just throwing it out there, I saw, I jotted down a connection with each of your individuals that just came to mind with connections with my work. But I'll first respond to what you were just saying. Yes, that was trying to tackle more than just a United States historiography even was challenging. And initially, it actually made me really think about to what extent I wanted this story, like how large I want the story to be, because it was so much more work to try and maintain. So I have the Ottoman historiography, Greek historiography, And of course, there's a language barrier because I do not read or speak Turkish, right? So I very carefully in my introduction crafted saying, this is an American story, you know, and I'm going to keep my focus on that. But I did want to bring in these other voices and tell a diverse story. And I think that's something that you also said, Nancy, that you wanted it to do right by discussing the Fijian culture. And that is, it's a challenge. So and I'm sure that I could have done better in my book, but I did my best, right? As far as like connections, if I may, is it all right if I? So just looking at your three individuals that you focus on, I thought with Whippy, where he's trying to maintain respectability by American standards while still getting a foothold in Fijian culture, you know, this foreign place, you know, like what is he willing to accept? What is he not? I definitely saw that with some of my merchants and even missionaries to some extent. The missionaries maybe less so, but even they find themselves very interested in this foreign culture that they've been thrown into. One story that comes to mind, at least with the merchants, David Offley, who is one of my non-state actors, trying to negotiate you know, a commercial presence in Smyrna without the permission of the United States. He writes home talking about how he hadn't expected to like anything about Ottoman culture or to see any sort of you know, like admirable qualities amongst the Ottomans in Smyrna. And he finds himself really respecting them, that they do have integrity, that they value family, that they're hospitable. And so he writes his sister about his surprise, and his sister is genuinely concerned that, you know, you're turning Turk, and what does this mean, right? So he teases her back and says, oh, I'm not turning Turk, but I mean, there are qualities that I do like about Ottoman culture. So some of my characters are trying to grapple with that as well. With Mary Wallace, I was really interested in the story of her acquiring a Fijian slave, and how you were trying to think about how she could reconcile that in her mind, since she did have anti-slavery sentiments. And just from some of the source material that I dealt with in my book, I kind of wondered if she rationalized that, well, this is different because it's not in the American South. Maybe this is different because I'm saving this Fijian from the society that she comes from. So I saw a connection there with trying to rationalize how this is somehow different from slavery in the American South. And then with Williams, where his measure of success is, to what extent is his success in commerce? And I saw a link with that just in the larger story that I tell, where the United States doesn't want to recognize Greek independence because they don't want anything to jeopardize their successful negotiation of a commercial treaty. Because for them, at the end of the day, that's what's more important. They're willing to completely renege in their fascination with Greece if it means getting in good with the Sultan. So anyway, those were just some of my thoughts.
That's a really wonderful way to wrap up the conversation. We are a little bit past our time limit. I do want to note that there is a great question about material culture and what was brought back to the United States. So if you want to maybe just say one sentence as we wrap up, Nancy, Maureen.
Yes, they were big collectors of Fijian objects, all the Americans in Fiji, and it's sad in a way because it means that a lot of the most precious artifacts of Fijian culture are actually in the United States. The Smithsonian has a huge collection from the United States Exploring Expedition, and also the PBS Essex Museum, because of all the Salem, Massachusetts traders who were in Fiji. They brought back objects. So, but both those places, very rich, beautiful Fijian, important Fijian materials are here in the US and elsewhere, of course, but large collections in the US.
And there was a huge interest in bringing stuff back from Italy, from Greece, but there was a lot of competition for that. The British, of course, have an already existing presence, working relationship with the Turks. The Elgin marbles, of course, are the most famous artifacts that are taken out of Greece and now reside in the British Museum. Americans, because they didn't have an established relationship there, and maybe other factors are at play as well, they did not bring back a lot of antiquities, but there certainly was interest in this sort of thing. And they certainly followed the Elgin marbles, for example, and the purchasing them by the British Museum.
I want to thank you both for this wonderful conversation. I learned so much from it and from your scholarship. Congratulations on your book. Thank you so much for joining us today, and best wishes on your future endeavors.
Thank you, Judy, for hosting, and to the attendees. Thank you.
Thank you too. Take care.